Three black Mercedes sedans tore into the gravel parking lot of Rosie's diner, their wheels grinding against the small stones like thunder in the quiet morning air. Maya Chen was polishing a glass tumbler when she spotted Mayor Robert Hartwell stepping out, followed by two lawyers in dark suits carrying leather briefcases. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he surveyed this tiny coffee shop where, for the past 3 months, Frank Kowalski had sat at the corner table every morning, drinking black coffee and leaving exactly $2 in tips. The old silver ring that Frank always twisted around his finger lay quietly on a crumpled napkin, next to today's copy of the Millbrook Herald. Maya gripped the glass tighter. The truth about Frank Kowalski was about to turn her small world completely upside down. The morning rush at Rosie's diner moved like clockwork, and Maya Chen had learned to read the rhythm of her regulars like sheet music. We wonder where you're watching from this morning, because maybe you've met someone like Maya. Someone juggling dreams bigger than their current reality while serving coffee with a smile that never quite reached their tired eyes. At 28, she moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her Syracuse University Law School textbooks stacked behind the counter like a promise she whispered to herself during every shift. The Syracuse tuition bills arrived monthly like clockwork, each one a reminder that her mother's medical expenses back in Rochester weren't getting any smaller, and her paycheck from the diner barely covered both obligations that kept her tethered to this small, upstate New York town. Frank Kowalski had become part of that clockwork 3 months ago, appearing every morning at 7:15 sharp to claim the corner table by the window. He was 73 with silver hair that caught the morning light, wearing the same rotation of 3 cardigans and always ordering black coffee with wheat toast, no butter. Maya had noticed how he folded his newspaper, the Millbrook Herald first, then the financial section of the Albany Times-Union, and how his weathered fingers would twist the silver ring on his right hand whenever he read something that made him pause. The ring looked handmade, worn smooth by decades of that same nervous gesture, and Maya found herself watching for it as a sign of his concentration. He never made conversation beyond polite requests, but he listened when she mentioned her law studies, asking thoughtful questions about contracts and municipal law that seemed oddly specific for casual interest. This particular Tuesday morning felt different from the moment Frank settled into his usual spot. The Millbrook Herald's front page carried a story about the delayed community center project, and Frank studied it longer than usual, his ring twisting more frequent and deliberate. Maya refilled his coffee cup twice before he looked up, and when he did, his gray eyes held something that might have been concern, or perhaps calculation. "Maya," he said, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before, "what kind of law are you planning to practice when you graduate?" She paused in wiping down the adjacent table, surprised by the directness of the question, and told him about her interest in public service law, helping communities navigate complex legal issues that affected ordinary people. Frank nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering about, then returned to his newspaper with an intensity that made her glance over her shoulder more than once. The breakfast crowd thinned by 9:30, leaving only Frank and Mrs. Patterson, who always lingered over her oatmeal while working crossword puzzles. Maya was restocking napkin dispensers when she noticed Frank checking his watch, an old Timex that looked as worn as his ring, before standing and reaching for his wallet. He left his usual $2 tip, but this time he also left the newspaper folded to the community center article, and when Maya looked more closely, she saw he'd circled several figures in the project budget with a pencil. The silver ring sat beside the napkin, forgotten in what appeared to be Frank's first moment of distraction in 3 months of perfect routine. Maya picked up the ring, planning to catch him in the parking lot, but through the window she watched his old Buick disappear down Maple Street before she could reach the door. The ring felt heavier than it looked, engraved with initials she couldn't quite make out, and a date from 1962. Maya slipped it into her apron pocket, planning to return it tomorrow morning when Frank arrived for his usual coffee. But as she cleared his table and folded the newspaper, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in the careful balance of her predictable world. The circled budget numbers seemed to stare at her from the page. $8.5 million for a community center that other towns had built for half that amount. and she found herself reading the article twice, wondering why Frank had found those figures worth highlighting. Rose, the diner's owner and Maya's surrogate mother figure, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh pie slices, took one look at Maya's expression, and asked what had her looking like she'd seen a ghost. Before Maya could answer, the rumble of expensive engines filled the parking lot, and 3 black Mercedes sedans arranged themselves like a presidential motorcade outside the diner's front windows. Mayor Hartwell emerged from the center vehicle, his usual politician's smile replaced by something that looked distinctly uncomfortable. And the 2 lawyers who flanked him carried themselves with the kind of authority that made other people step aside automatically. Maya's hand instinctively went to the ring in her apron pocket as the mayor approached the entrance, his eyes scanning the diner's interior with an urgency that seemed completely out of proportion to anything that belonged in Rosie's simple dining room. The bell above the door chimed like a warning as they entered, and Maya realized that Frank's forgotten ring was about to become the least mysterious part of her day. Mayor Hartwell moved through Rosie's diner like a man carrying news too heavy for casual conversation, his polished shoes clicking against the checkered linoleum in sharp contrast to the soft murmur of morning regulars finishing their coffee. The 2 lawyers flanking him, one carrying a leather portfolio thick enough to contain a small library, the other consulting what appeared to be legal documents, surveyed the humble dining room with the careful attention of people accustomed to boardrooms and courthouses. Maya watched from behind the counter as they approached, her hand still clutching Frank's forgotten ring in her apron pocket, while Rose emerged from the kitchen with flour-dusted hands and the kind of protective expression she reserved for anyone who might disturb her customer's peace. The mayor's face carried none of his usual campaign-ready warmth, and when he asked to speak with Maya Chen privately, his voice held the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would change everything. "Miss Chen," Mayor Hartwell began, settling his considerable frame into the booth across from where Maya sat, while the lawyers remained standing like sentinels flanking their conversation. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Frank Kowalski." The taller lawyer, who introduced himself as William Garrett from the firm of Garrett, Morrison & Associates in Albany, opened his portfolio and withdrew a document bearing official seals and signatures that looked important enough to alter the course of ordinary lives. Maya's throat tightened as she absorbed the careful language they used. Frank had passed away peacefully in his sleep at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, where he'd been living since his wife died 2 years ago, and while his death wasn't unexpected given his recent health decline, the circumstances surrounding his final legal arrangements were anything but ordinary. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with whatever revelation was coming next, while Garrett arranged papers on the table with the methodical precision of someone who delivered life-changing news many times before. "Miss Chen," Garrett continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of practice law. Francis Eugene Kowalski was not simply a regular customer at this establishment. Maya felt the world tilt slightly as the lawyer explained that Frank, her quiet, cardigan-wearing coffee companion, had been the founder and CEO of Kowalski Industries, one of the largest construction and development companies in New York State, with contracts spanning from Buffalo to the Hudson Valley and annual revenues exceeding $47 million. The company had built shopping centers, office complexes, and municipal buildings across upstate New York for nearly 3 decades, and Frank had stepped down from active management only 18 months ago when his health began declining. Though he'd retained majority ownership until his death, Maya's mind raced back through 3 months of conversations about law school and her dreams of public service, wondering how a man worth tens of millions of dollars had spent his mornings discussing municipal contracts with a waitress who barely made ends meet. The mayor cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo with the weight of what came next, and Maya realized that Frank's interest in her legal studies hadn't been casual conversation after all. "According to Mr. Kowalski's last will and testament," Garrett explained, sliding the official document across the table's surface, "he has left his entire estate, including Kowalski Industries, all associated holdings, investment accounts, and real property, to you, Miss Chen, with the sole stipulation that you oversee the completion of the Millbrook Community Center project and establish the Kowalski Foundation for Community Development." Maya stared at the document, her eyes unable to focus on the legal language that spelled out an inheritance worth $47 million, while her mind struggled to process how 3 months of morning coffee conversations had somehow convinced a man she barely knew to entrust her with his life's work. The number seemed abstract, too large to connect with the reality of her student loan debt and her mother's medical bills, and she found herself thinking about the ring in her pocket, how Frank had twisted it whenever he was deep in thought about something important. "But why me?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to reconcile the Frank she knew, quiet, observant, kind but distant, with the image of a business magnate who'd built an empire large enough to transform entire communities. Garrett consulted his notes before explaining that Frank's written instructions described Maya as demonstrating exceptional character, moral judgment, and the educational background necessary to ensure responsible stewardship of resources intended for public benefit. The mayor added that Frank had apparently spent considerable time researching Maya's academic record at Syracuse, her work history, and even her volunteer activities with the local literacy program, painting a picture of surveillance that felt both flattering and slightly unsettling. Maya remembered how Frank had asked specific questions about contract law and municipal governance, conversations she'd assumed were the idle curiosity of someone with time to fill, but now realized had been something closer to an extended interview for a position she'd never known existed. The immediate practical implications began settling around Maya like snow accumulating on familiar ground, transforming the landscape of her life into something unrecognizable. Garrett explained that she would need to assume control of Kowalski Industries within 30 days, oversee the completion of the community center project that had been stalled due to budget complications, and establish the foundation's operational framework before the end of the fiscal year. The mayor mentioned that the community center had been a source of considerable frustration for Millbrook residents, who'd been promised a facility that would provide after-school programs, senior services, and job training, but had seen construction delays and cost overruns that threatened to derail the entire project. Maya pulled Frank's ring from her apron pocket, turning it over in her palm as she tried to imagine herself in boardrooms and construction meetings, making decisions that would affect hundreds of jobs and thousands of community members who needed the services the center would provide. "There's something else," the mayor added, his tone carrying a note of caution that made Maya look up from the ring she'd been studying. "The community center project has been problematic. We've had concerns about cost overruns and some irregularities in the contracting process that Frank was investigating before his death." Garrett nodded grimly, explaining that Frank had requested copies of all project documentation in recent weeks, expressing concern about expenses that seemed excessive for the scope of work involved, and had scheduled meetings with project managers that never took place due to his sudden passing. Maya felt a chill of recognition as she remembered the newspaper Frank had left behind with budget figures circled in pencil, and realized that his morning reading hadn't been casual interest in local affairs, but active investigation into problems that might require exactly the kind of legal expertise she was developing. The inheritance was beginning to feel less like an unexpected gift and more like a mission Frank had been preparing her to undertake, complete with enemies she didn't yet understand, and responsibilities that extended far beyond managing money to ensuring justice for a community that had trusted their leaders to build something worthwhile. As the lawyers packed their documents and prepared to leave, scheduling follow-up meetings that would formally transfer control of Frank's empire, Maya sat in the familiar booth where she'd served coffee to hundreds of customers, holding a ring that represented decades of someone else's dreams and decisions. The diner continued operating around her, Rose refilling coffee cups, Mrs. Patterson working her crossword puzzle, the lunch crowd beginning to filter in. But Maya felt suspended between her old life of predictable routines and a new reality where she would need to learn how to wield power responsibly in a world that Frank had apparently discovered was more dangerous than it appeared. She slipped the ring onto her right hand, surprised to find it fit perfectly, and wondered if Frank had somehow known that too, or if it was just one more impossible coincidence in a morning that had already redefined everything she thought she understood about kindness, opportunity, and the hidden complexity of ordinary lives. The 40-story glass tower housing Kowalski Industries rose from downtown Albany like a monument to ambition, its reflective surface catching morning sunlight and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to shift with Maya's perspective as she approached the building's imposing entrance. She had traded her diner uniform for her best interview suit, a navy blazer and skirt she'd bought for law school presentations, but still felt underdressed among the stream of professionals moving through the marble lobby with the confident stride of people who belonged in places where decisions worth millions of dollars were made daily. The security guard checked her identification twice before issuing a visitor's badge, and the elevator ride to the 32nd floor gave Maya time to study her reflection in the polished steel doors, trying to reconcile the image of the woman looking back at her with Frank's quiet assessment that she possessed the qualities necessary to oversee an empire built on concrete and steel. Patricia Vance, the chief financial officer, waited in the executive conference room with the kind of polished professionalism that came from decades of navigating corporate hierarchies where appearance mattered as much as competence. She was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a chignon that emphasized sharp cheekbones and eyes that assessed Maya with undisguised skepticism, while her handshake carried just enough pressure to suggest confidence without crossing into aggression. "Miss Chen," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to controlling conversations, "I must say, we were all quite surprised by Frank's decision to expand our leadership team in this particular manner." The pause before expand hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya realized that her inheritance hadn't just given her control of a company, but had also made her the focal point of whatever office politics had been brewing during Frank's absence from active management. Marcus Sterling, the director of project development, entered the conference room with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome in spaces like this, his expensive suit and firm handshake suggesting the kind of success that came from understanding how to navigate the intersection of public projects and private profit. He was younger than Patricia, perhaps 42, with the kind of tan that spoke of golf memberships and weekend homes, and when he spoke about the community center project, his tone carried the casual authority of someone who'd managed similar developments without needing to explain every decision to committees or community groups. "The Millbrook project has been more complex than initially anticipated," he explained, spreading architectural plans and budget documents across the conference table's polished surface. "Municipal projects always involve more stakeholders and regulatory requirements than private development, which tends to drive costs higher than our original projections suggested." Maya studied the documents with the analytical skills she'd developed through law school, comparing the Millbrook budget against similar projects she found in the company's files, and immediately noticed discrepancies that seemed significant enough to warrant Frank's concern. The community center was budgeted at $8.5 million for a 30,000-square-foot facility with basic amenities, gymnasium, meeting rooms, kitchen facilities, and office space, while comparable projects in neighboring towns like Saratoga Springs and Glens Falls had been completed for between $3 and $4 million. When Maya pointed out these comparisons, Marcus explained that Millbrook's project included enhanced specifications and premium materials that justified the additional expense. But when pressed for details, his explanations became vague references to architectural requirements and structural considerations that seemed designed to discourage further questioning rather than provide actual clarification. The contract documentation revealed another pattern that made Maya's legal training sound quiet alarms throughout her mind. Sterling Construction, the primary contractor for the community center, had been awarded the project without the competitive bidding process typically required for municipal developments, instead receiving what the paperwork described as a sole source contract based on their specialized expertise in community facility construction. Maya spent an hour reviewing Sterling Construction's corporate information, discovering that the company had been incorporated only 18 months ago, with Marcus Sterling listed as president and sole proprietor, creating what appeared to be a circular arrangement where the project director had essentially awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to himself. When she raised this concern, Patricia intervened with explanations about internal efficiency and streamlined project management. But her answers carried the kind of practiced smoothness that suggested she'd anticipated these questions and prepared responses designed to deflect rather than illuminate. The financial trail became more troubling as Maya dug deeper into the project's payment schedule, discovering that Sterling Construction had already received advance payments totaling $3.2 million despite minimal visible progress on the construction site. According to the project timeline, foundation work should have been completed months ago, but when Maya asked to visit the site, Marcus cited safety protocols and insurance liability concerns that required advanced scheduling and safety equipment she didn't possess. Patricia supported these restrictions with references to corporate policy and legal requirements, but Maya noticed how their explanations seemed coordinated, as if they'd discussed how to handle exactly these kinds of questions from someone with enough legal knowledge to understand what she was seeing. The pattern reminded her of cases she'd studied in law school where legitimate business processes had been manipulated to hide fraudulent activities. And she began to understand why Frank had been circling budget figures and scheduling meetings with project managers. The afternoon brought additional revelations that painted an increasingly concerning picture of how the Millbrook project was being managed, or perhaps more accurately, mismanaged for someone's benefit. Maya discovered email exchanges between Patricia and Marcus discussing cost management strategies and timeline adjustments that seemed to prioritize payment schedules over actual construction progress, and several references to maintaining flexibility in ways that suggested they expected continued delays and budget increases. When she asked about oversight from the Millbrook Town Council, Patricia explained that municipal clients preferred to minimize involvement in day-to-day project management, allowing Kowalski Industries to handle technical details without constant supervision. But Maya recognized this arrangement as exactly the kind of situation that created opportunities for the kind of exploitation Frank had apparently been investigating. As the day ended, and Maya prepared to leave the glass tower that now represented her unexpected responsibilities, she realized that Frank's inheritance had been more than generous recognition of her character. It had been his way of ensuring that someone with legal training and moral commitment would be positioned to uncover and address the corruption he'd discovered. The ring on her finger felt heavier as she understood that Frank had spent his final months not just observing her kindness toward an old man in a diner, but evaluating whether she possessed the combination of intelligence, integrity, and determination necessary to clean up a mess that threatened to steal millions of dollars from a community that needed those resources for legitimate purposes. Patricia and Marcus had treated her with the kind of condescension reserved for outsiders who didn't understand how things really worked. But Maya was beginning to understand exactly how things worked, and why Frank had chosen someone from outside their system to ensure that justice would eventually triumph over the comfortable corruption that had taken root in his company's operations. Maya's kitchen table disappeared beneath spreadsheets, bank statements, and contractor invoices as she transformed her modest apartment into a forensic accounting laboratory. The skills she'd learned in her Syracuse University courses on corporate law and financial analysis finally finding practical application in a case that would have impressed her professors with its complexity. The laptop she'd purchased secondhand for law school now hummed with activity as she cross-referenced payment schedules against construction timelines, creating Excel worksheets that tracked every dollar flowing from Kowalski Industries to Sterling Construction with the methodical precision of someone who understood that justice often came down to mathematics and meticulous documentation. She worked through the night, fueled by coffee and the growing conviction that Frank had left her more than money. He'd left her a puzzle that would require every piece of legal knowledge she possessed to solve completely and effectively. The payment records revealed a pattern sophisticated enough to suggest professional planning, but flawed enough to leave traces that someone with accounting training could follow like breadcrumbs through a forest of corporate obfuscation. Sterling Construction had received its first advance payment of $1.2 million, 3 months before any construction equipment appeared at the Millbrook site, followed by subsequent payments justified by progress reports that described foundation work, electrical preparation, and material procurement that Maya's site visit suggested had never actually occurred. When she drove to the construction area early Tuesday morning, she found a fenced lot with survey stakes and some cleared ground, but no evidence of the concrete work. utility installation, or material storage that would have justified payments totaling $3.2 million to date. The corporate structure behind Sterling Construction proved even more interesting when Maya applied her legal research skills to uncover the web of relationships connecting the various entities involved in the Millbrook project. Using the New York State Department of State's corporate database, she discovered that Sterling Construction shared the same registered address as Vance Financial Services, a consulting firm owned by Patricia Vance, and that both companies had been incorporated within 6 months of each other by the same Albany law firm. The registered agent for Sterling Construction was listed as Patricia Vance, while Marcus Sterling served as president, creating a corporate arrangement that allowed them to control both sides of the contracting relationship while maintaining the appearance of arm's-length business transactions. Maya's investigation into Sterling Construction's business address led her to a nondescript office complex in Syracuse, where she discovered that Suite 207 consisted of a single room containing a desk, a telephone, and a mailbox. Clearly, a virtual office arrangement designed to provide legal registration without actual business operations. The building's management company confirmed that Sterling Construction paid monthly rent for mail forwarding services, but had never conducted business meetings or maintained staff at the location, which meant that a construction company supposedly managing an $8.5 million municipal project operated entirely through postal mail and electronic communications. This discovery prompted Maya to examine Sterling Construction's equipment and licensing requirements, revealing that the company possessed no heavy machinery, employed no construction workers, and maintained no contractor's insurance coverage sufficient for a project of Millbrook's scope. The email correspondence between Patricia and Marcus, which Maya accessed through her legitimate authority as the new owner of Kowalski Industries, provided the most damning evidence of their scheme to systematically extract money from the community center project while delivering minimal actual construction value. Their communications discussed maximizing early payment schedules and managing timeline expectations, with the casual tone of people who'd perfected this process through previous experience. And several messages referenced other municipal projects where they'd employed similar strategies with apparently successful results. One particularly revealing exchange from 6 weeks ago showed Patricia advising Marcus to accelerate the payment requests before Frank starts asking harder questions, suggesting they'd been aware of increased scrutiny from the company's founder and had attempted to extract as much money as possible before their activities attracted serious investigation. The financial analysis that kept Maya working until dawn revealed the elegant simplicity underlying their sophisticated fraud. Sterling Construction would submit invoices for construction phases that existed only on paper. Patricia would approve payments through her CFO authority, and the money would flow into Sterling's accounts where it could be distributed to shell companies or withdrawn as consulting fees and project management expenses that bore no relationship to actual work performed. Maya calculated that they'd already extracted approximately $2.8 million from the project for non-existent services, while the legitimate construction costs for completed work totaled less than $400,000, creating a gap large enough to fund several smaller community projects or provide significant cost savings for Millbrook's taxpayers. The legal framework for addressing their fraud required careful consideration of both criminal and civil remedies, and Maya realized that Frank had positioned her perfectly to pursue both approaches simultaneously. As the new owner of Kowalski Industries, she possessed the standing to file civil lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion of corporate assets, while the evidence of mail fraud and conspiracy provided grounds for criminal referrals to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of New York. Maya spent Wednesday morning drafting a comprehensive memo documenting the fraud scheme, complete with financial exhibits and timeline analysis that would allow prosecutors to understand exactly how Patricia and Marcus had manipulated the system to steal millions of dollars from a community development project. The moment of confrontation approached as Maya prepared to present her findings to Patricia and Marcus, knowing that their responses would determine whether the situation could be resolved through restitution and resignation, or would require the full weight of criminal prosecution to ensure justice for Millbrook's residents. She placed Frank's ring on her finger as a reminder of the trust he'd placed in her judgment. understanding that the next phase of this investigation would test not only her legal skills, but also her courage to stand against people who'd built their careers on exploiting the kinds of communities that had welcomed Frank's morning visits to a small-town diner. The spreadsheets and documents covering her kitchen table represented more than evidence of corporate fraud. They represented the foundation for restoring integrity to a system that Frank had spent his final months trying to protect from the corruption that threatened to undermine everything he'd worked to build. The 32nd floor conference room at Kowalski Industries felt different when Maya entered carrying her meticulously organized evidence folders. The morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that seemed to dance with the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Patricia Vance sat at the head of the polished mahogany table with her usual composed demeanor. But Maya noticed the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd already guessed why this emergency meeting had been called, while Marcus Sterling occupied his customary seat with the kind of forced casualness that reminded Maya of defendants she'd observed during law school courtroom visits who knew their carefully constructed lies were about to unravel. William Garrett, Frank's longtime attorney, had positioned himself strategically near the windows, his presence serving as both legal counsel and silent witness to whatever confrontation was about to unfold in this room, where millions of dollars had been stolen through paperwork and professional courtesy. Maya opened her first folder and spread financial documents across the table with the deliberate precision of someone who'd spent days preparing for this moment. Each spreadsheet and bank statement positioned to build an irrefutable case that would strip away the comfortable fiction that Sterling Construction represented legitimate business operations. "I've completed my analysis of the Millbrook Community Center project," she began, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd practiced in law school moot court competitions. "And I've discovered systematic fraud that has diverted approximately $2.8 million from construction activities into personal accounts controlled by Sterling Construction and its affiliated entities." Patricia's composure slipped just enough for Maya to catch a flicker of something that might have been fear or calculation, while Marcus leaned forward with the aggressive posture of someone preparing to attack the credibility of evidence he couldn't dispute on its merits. The financial evidence unfolded like a prosecutor's opening statement, each document building upon the previous one to create a comprehensive picture of deliberate deception designed to enrich Patricia and Marcus at the expense of Millbrook's residents, who'd been promised a community center that would serve their children and elderly neighbors. Maya presented the timeline showing payments for foundation work that had never been completed, electrical systems that existed only in invoices, and material purchases that had never been delivered to the construction site, while cross-referencing these phantom expenses against Sterling Construction's actual business operations, or rather, the complete absence of any legitimate construction capability. Sterling Construction has no equipment, no employees, no contractors' licenses, and no insurance coverage adequate for municipal construction projects, Maya continued, watching Marcus's face flush with the kind of anger that came from being caught rather than genuine indignation at false accusations. Patricia attempted to regain control of the narrative by suggesting that Maya's inexperience with construction industry practices had led her to misinterpret normal business procedures, explaining that advance payments and phased billing were standard practices that someone with Maya's limited corporate background might find confusing or suspicious. Municipal projects involve complex regulatory requirements and environmental considerations that often necessitate extended planning phases and preliminary work that might not be immediately visible to casual observers, Patricia said, her voice carrying the condescending tone of someone who'd successfully intimidated questioners in the past through superior knowledge and professional authority. Maya responded by presenting the comparative analysis she'd prepared, showing how similar community centers in neighboring towns had been completed for half the cost and twice the speed, effectively demonstrating that Millbrook's project delays and cost overruns represented deliberate manipulation rather than industry-standard complications. Marcus's defense strategy centered on attacking Maya's legitimacy as Frank's successor, suggesting that her sudden elevation from waitress to corporate executive raised questions about her fitness to oversee complex business operations that required years of experience to understand properly. "With all due respect, Miss Chen," he said, his tone carrying anything but respect, Managing a multi-million-dollar construction project requires expertise that can't be acquired through part-time law school classes and coffee shop conversations with an elderly gentleman who may not have been thinking clearly in his final months. Maya had anticipated this line of attack and was prepared with Garrett's confirmation that Frank's mental competency had been thoroughly evaluated and documented during the will preparation process, and that the inheritance included specific protections designed to prevent exactly these kinds of challenges to her authority and decision-making capability. The confrontation reached its critical moment when Maya presented the email correspondence between Patricia and Marcus, their own words providing unambiguous evidence of their conspiracy to maximize extraction from the Millbrook project while managing timeline expectations to avoid scrutiny until they could complete their theft of community resources. These communications demonstrate deliberate fraud, conspiracy to commit mail fraud, and violation of your fiduciary duties as corporate officers, Maya stated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system as she delivered an ultimatum that would determine whether this situation could be resolved through corporate discipline or would require criminal prosecution. I'm offering you one opportunity to resign your positions and arrange full restitution of the stolen funds within 48 hours, or I will refer this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office and pursue both criminal charges and civil litigation to recover damages. Patricia and Marcus exchanged glances that confirmed their partnership in ways that went far beyond professional collaboration. And Maya realized that their fraud scheme had been refined through previous projects where they'd successfully exploited the trust of communities too small or unsophisticated to conduct the kind of forensic analysis that had exposed their operations. Marcus attempted one final gambit by threatening to expose what he characterized as irregularities in Frank's estate planning, suggesting that Maya's inheritance might not survive legal challenges from Frank's more distant relatives, who had stronger claims to his business empire than a waitress who'd known him for only 3 months. Garrett intervened immediately, producing documentation that showed Frank's will had been prepared with meticulous attention to legal requirements specifically designed to prevent such challenges, and that any attempt to contest the inheritance would face insurmountable legal obstacles that would likely result in sanctions against any attorney foolish enough to pursue such claims. The meeting concluded with Patricia and Marcus refusing Maya's offer of negotiated settlement, instead choosing to bet their futures on their ability to discredit her authority and maintain their positions through political connections and legal maneuvering that had served them well in previous confrontations with inconvenient oversight. Maya gathered her evidence folders with the calm efficiency of someone who'd prepared for exactly this outcome, understanding that their refusal to accept responsibility would now require her to demonstrate that Frank's faith in her character and capabilities had been justified through actions rather than words. As she walked toward the elevator, Maya twisted Frank's ring around her finger and thought about the community center that Millbrook's children and seniors deserved, knowing that the next phase of this battle would test everything she'd learned about justice, courage, and the difference between having power and using it responsibly. The Millbrook Town Hall buzzed with an energy Maya had never witnessed in her years living in this quiet upstate community. Its usual capacity of 80 people stretched to accommodate nearly 200 residents who'd gathered on a Thursday evening that would determine whether their community center project represented hope fulfilled or trust betrayed. Patricia Vance and Marcus Sterling sat in the front row with their attorney, a sharp-faced woman from a prestigious Albany firm whose presence suggested they'd escalated their defense strategy beyond simple denial into active legal warfare, while Maya occupied a seat near the presentation podium, her evidence folders organized with the precision of someone who understood that the next 2 hours would determine not only the fate of millions of dollars, but also the future of public trust in institutions that were supposed to serve community interests rather than private greed. Mayor Hartwell called the emergency session to order with the kind of gravity usually reserved for declarations of local emergencies, explaining that serious questions had been raised about the community center project that required immediate public attention and transparent discussion of how taxpayer funds and private donations were being managed. The town council members, 5 elected residents whose day jobs ranged from insurance sales to elementary school teaching, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the corporate legal drama unfolding in their usually mundane chambers. But Maya recognized that their discomfort represented exactly the kind of democratic oversight that Patricia and Marcus had been counting on to avoid throughout their scheme. Patricia rose first to address the assembly, her presentation polished with the kind of professional authority that had probably intimidated previous questioners into silence, as she painted Maya as an inexperienced outsider whose misunderstanding of standard industry practices threatened to derail a project that would benefit every family in Millbrook. Miss Chen's allegations stem from her unfamiliarity with the complex regulatory environment governing municipal construction projects, Patricia explained, her voice carrying the measured confidence of someone who'd successfully defended questionable practices through superior expertise and careful manipulation of technical language that most people wouldn't challenge. She presented charts showing construction industry averages and regulatory compliance costs that seemed designed to justify the Millbrook project's inflated budget, while subtly suggesting that Maya's legal education had ill-prepared her for the practical realities of managing multi-million-dollar developments. Marcus followed with what appeared to be a coordinated strategy to discredit both Maya's competence and Frank's mental state during his final months, suggesting that the elderly businessman had been influenced by inappropriate relationships that clouded his judgment about succession planning and corporate governance. Frank Kowalski was a brilliant entrepreneur, Marcus said, his tone carrying the kind of false respect that barely concealed contempt. But age and isolation can affect even the most capable minds, leading to decisions that reflect emotional attachment rather than sound business judgment. Maya felt anger building in her chest as Marcus implied that her conversations with Frank had somehow manipulated a vulnerable old man. But she forced herself to remain calm and focused on the evidence that would speak more eloquently than any emotional response to these calculated insults. When Maya's turn came to present her case, she began not with financial analysis, but with a simple question that cut through the professional obfuscation Patricia and Marcus had deployed to confuse the issue. "How many of you have driven past the community center construction site recently?" she asked, watching hands rise throughout the audience as residents acknowledged what their own eyes had told them about the gap between promised progress and visible reality. Maya then presented a photograph she'd taken the previous morning, showing the largely empty lot that had supposedly received $3.2 million worth of construction work, followed by photographs of completed community centers in neighboring towns that had cost half as much and taken half as long to build. The visual evidence created a murmur of recognition and anger throughout the hall as people realized they'd been watching their community resources disappear into phantom construction projects that existed mainly in invoices and progress reports. The financial documentation that Maya presented next transformed resident frustration into focused outrage as she methodically demonstrated how Sterling Construction had functioned as little more than an elaborate invoice-generating mechanism designed to transfer community development funds into private accounts. She explained how Patricia's approval of payments for non-existent work had violated both corporate fiduciary duties and municipal contracting requirements, while Marcus's creation of a contractor with no actual construction capability had constituted fraud on a scale that threatened not only the community center but also public confidence in any future development projects. "These aren't accounting errors or industry misunderstandings," Maya stated clearly. "These are deliberate crimes committed against every family that was promised a safe place for their children to learn and play after school." The most dramatic moment came when Maya presented the email correspondence between Patricia and Marcus, reading selected passages that revealed their casual attitude toward stealing community resources and their contempt for the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to protect public interests. The phrase, "maximize extraction before anyone starts asking harder questions," hung in the air like an accusation that no amount of professional reputation could deflect, while their discussion of managing timeline expectations to avoid scrutiny demonstrated the premeditated nature of their fraud scheme. Several council members looked visibly shocked by the evidence of deliberate deception, while residents in the audience began calling out questions and demands for accountability that transformed the formal hearing into something approaching a town meeting where democracy actually functioned. Patricia and Marcus's attorney attempted damage control by challenging the admissibility of evidence obtained through Maya's unauthorized access to corporate communications. But Maya had anticipated this objection and was prepared with Garrett's legal opinion that her position as Frank's legitimate successor gave her full authority to review any documents related to company operations. The attorney's arguments about due process and presumption of innocence seemed increasingly desperate as the weight of evidence accumulated beyond any reasonable doubt, while her client's visible discomfort suggested they were beginning to understand that their strategy of intimidation and legal technicalities wouldn't protect them from the consequences of crimes committed in plain sight of anyone with sufficient motivation to look carefully at the numbers. The evening concluded with the town council voting unanimously to terminate Kowalski Industries' contract for the community center project and to support Maya's recommendation for criminal referral to federal authorities, while also endorsing her proposal to restart construction using local contractors whose bids would be evaluated through transparent public processes designed to prevent future exploitation. Maya's final words to the assembly carried the weight of Frank's legacy and her own commitment to ensuring that community development would serve community interests rather than private greed. This project will be completed as promised, within budget, and with the kind of transparency that honors the trust you've placed in institutions that are supposed to work for you rather than against you. As residents filed out of the town hall, many stopping to thank Maya for her courage in confronting corruption that had hidden behind professional credentials and corporate authority, she realized that Frank's ring on her finger represented not just personal inheritance, but also the ongoing responsibility to ensure that power served justice rather than personal enrichment. The headlines in the Albany Times-Union and Millbrook Herald painted the kind of picture that district attorneys dream about when building cases against white-collar criminals, with phrases like "municipal fraud scheme exposed" and "community leader uncovers million-dollar theft," creating the kind of public attention that made plea negotiations considerably more attractive than jury trials for defendants whose crimes had been documented with forensic precision. Patricia Vance and Marcus Sterling found themselves facing federal charges that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than months, as the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of New York treated their systematic theft of community development funds as exactly the kind of public corruption that undermined citizen confidence in democratic institutions. Within 2 weeks of Maya's presentation to the town council, both defendants had entered guilty pleas in exchange for agreements requiring full restitution of stolen funds and cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar schemes they might have perpetrated in other municipalities across upstate New York. Maya's transformation of Kowalski Industries from a traditional construction company into a community-focused social enterprise required the kind of strategic thinking she'd never imagined needing when she was serving coffee and studying contract law between customer orders. Working with William Garrett and a team of consultants recommended by Syracuse University's business school, she restructured the company's mission statement to prioritize community benefit over profit maximization, establishing transparent bidding processes and community oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of exploitation that Frank had discovered during his final months. The new Kowalski Foundation received its initial funding from the restituted money recovered from Patricia and Marcus, creating an endowment that would support community development projects throughout upstate New York while generating sustainable revenue to maintain the company's operations. The restart of Millbrook's Community Center project became a model for how public-private partnerships could function when transparency and accountability replaced the cozy relationships that had enabled systematic fraud to flourish under the cover of professional expertise. Maya organized competitive bidding that attracted 12 qualified contractors, ultimately selecting Hendricks Construction, a family-owned business from nearby Schenectady whose bid came in at $3.8 million for a facility that would exceed the original specifications by including energy-efficient systems and accessibility features that reflected current best practices rather than minimum legal requirements. The cost savings of $4.7 million allowed Maya to propose additional community investments that had never been considered possible under the original budget projections that Patricia and Marcus had inflated to fund their theft. The construction timeline that had been deliberately extended to maximize fraudulent billing was compressed to 18 months through honest project management that prioritized completion over invoice generation, with regular community meetings that allowed residents to observe progress and ask questions about any aspect of the development process. Maya established a community oversight committee that included representatives from the senior center, youth programs, local businesses, and neighborhood associations, ensuring that the facility would truly serve the diverse needs that had originally justified the investment in community infrastructure. The transparency that replaced secretive contractor relationships created a sense of ownership among residents who could see their tax dollars and donated funds being converted into tangible benefits for families who needed safe spaces for children, seniors, and working adults seeking job training opportunities. The educational component of the expanded project reflected Maya's understanding that sustainable community development required investment in human capital as well as physical infrastructure, leading to partnerships with Syracuse University, Hudson Valley Community College, and the State University of New York system that would bring degree-granting programs directly to Millbrook residents who couldn't afford to relocate for higher education. The Frank Kowalski Memorial Scholarship Program provided full tuition support for local students pursuing degrees in law, business, engineering, and education, with service commitments that would bring graduates back to serve communities like the one that had invested in their development. Maya's own experience transitioning from service industry work to corporate leadership informed her design of bridge programs that would help working adults develop professional skills without sacrificing the income they needed to support their families during career transitions. The measurable impact of transparent governance and community-focused investment became evident within 6 months of the project restart, as unemployment in Millbrook decreased by 23%, while median household income increased by 18%. Through new employment opportunities created by construction activity and expanded small business development supported by foundation microgrants. Local contractors who had been excluded from previous projects found themselves competing for opportunities based on qualifications and price, rather than personal relationships with project directors, creating a more competitive environment that benefited taxpayers while providing fair opportunities for businesses that had previously been shut out of municipal contracts. The ripple effects extended beyond Millbrook as neighboring communities began requesting consultations about implementing similar transparency measures and community oversight mechanisms for their own development projects. Maya's success in transforming a fraud-tainted project into a model of community development attracted attention from municipal leaders across New York State, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and consulting requests from towns struggling with their own suspicions about contractor relationships and project management practices. The Kowalski Foundation expanded its mission to provide technical assistance and oversight services to communities that lacked the resources to conduct their own forensic investigations when development projects seemed to be costing more and delivering less than comparable efforts in similar municipalities. Maya found herself traveling throughout the Northeast, helping small towns implement the kind of transparent governance practices that could prevent the exploitation Frank had uncovered in his final investigation, while always returning to Millbrook, where the community center construction progressed with the steady reliability of honest work performed by people who understood they were building something that would serve families for generations. The completion of the first phase of construction, the main gymnasium and meeting rooms, was celebrated with a community gathering that drew nearly 500 residents who came to see what their patience and Maya's persistence had accomplished together. Children ran across the polished wooden floors while their parents examined the kitchen facilities that would support after-school programs and community events, and seniors tested the accessibility features that would allow them to participate in fitness programs and social activities regardless of mobility limitations. Maya stood in the center of the gymnasium, wearing Frank's ring and thinking about the morning 3 months ago when she'd been serving coffee to a quiet old man who'd been planning this moment while pretending to read the newspaper, understanding that his gift had been far more valuable than money. It had been the opportunity to prove that ordinary people could overcome systemic corruption when they possessed the courage to demand accountability from institutions that were supposed to serve the public interest rather than private greed. The familiar bell above Rosie's diner chimed with the same gentle welcome it had offered Maya thousands of times before. But as she entered the small restaurant on a crisp October morning exactly 1 year after Frank Kowalski's final visit, everything felt transformed by the journey that had taken her from serving coffee to rebuilding communities across upstate New York. Rose looked up from the coffee machine with the kind of smile that reserved special warmth for family members who'd ventured into the wider world and returned with stories worth telling. While the morning regulars, Mrs. Patterson with her crossword puzzle, Jim Hendricks taking a break from supervising the community center's final construction phase, and 3 new faces Maya didn't recognize, created the comfortable murmur of conversation that had provided the soundtrack to her dreams of legal career and financial stability that seemed both distant and immediate. Maya settled into Frank's corner booth, the same spot where he'd twisted his silver ring while reading about municipal projects and asking questions about her legal studies that had seemed like casual conversation, but had actually been the most important job interview of her life. The view through the window now included the completed Millbrook Community Center, its red brick facade and large windows reflecting morning sunlight. While early arrivals for senior fitness classes and job training programs created the kind of purposeful activity that Frank had envisioned when he'd circled budget figures and planned his final gift to someone he'd identified as possessing the character necessary to turn corruption into opportunity for community benefit. Rose brought coffee without being asked, the same blend Frank had preferred, served in the same thick ceramic mug that had accompanied their morning conversations about justice, responsibility, and the difference between having power and using it wisely. The silver ring on Maya's finger caught the light as she lifted her coffee cup, its surface now engraved with the inscription Frank had arranged through his attorney. For Maya, keep fighting. Words that reminded her daily that inheritance carried obligations as well as opportunities to improve the lives of people who deserved honest governance and transparent use of public resources. The ring had become a touchstone during difficult moments when corporate executives or municipal officials had attempted to intimidate her with superior knowledge or professional credentials, reminding her that Frank's confidence in her judgment had been based on character rather than experience, and that moral courage often mattered more than technical expertise when confronting systematic injustice. She'd worn it during testimony before the state legislature about municipal contracting reform, during negotiations with federal prosecutors about recovery of stolen funds, and during groundbreaking ceremonies for community centers in 6 towns that had requested Kowalski Foundation assistance in implementing transparent development processes. The morning newspaper, still the Millbrook Herald, though now printed in expanded format to accommodate increased advertising from local businesses benefiting from community center activities and foundation-supported economic development, carried a feature story about the scholarship recipients who would begin college programs in January, including 3 young people from Maya's old neighborhood who would study law, engineering, and education with commitments to return and serve communities that had invested in their futures. Maya read about their dreams and ambitions while thinking about her own transformation from someone who'd worried about paying tuition bills to someone who could ensure that financial barriers wouldn't prevent motivated students from developing the skills their communities needed to prosper and govern themselves effectively. The scholarship program had become one of the Foundation's most successful initiatives, creating pathways for local talent to acquire professional expertise while maintaining connections to the places that had shaped their values and understanding of public service. Rose slid into the booth across from Maya, bringing the kind of update conversation that had become their monthly tradition whenever Maya returned to Millbrook between consulting trips and Foundation board meetings that now filled her calendar with opportunities to replicate the success they'd achieved in transforming fraud into community benefit. The afternoon programs at the center are booked solid through December, Rose reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd watched a neighbor's dreams become reality through determination and careful planning. Between the job training classes, the senior wellness programs, and the after-school tutoring, they're talking about needing to expand the facility again within 2 years. Maya smiled at the problem of success, remembering how the original project had been designed to serve immediate needs rather than accommodate the kind of comprehensive community development that transparent governance and adequate funding could support when corruption was eliminated from the equation. The expansion plans that Maya and the Community Oversight Committee had been developing would add a library wing, additional meeting spaces, and a business incubator that would provide startup support for local entrepreneurs whose ideas could create employment opportunities while addressing community needs that larger corporations ignored or underserved. The Frank Kowalski Memorial Library would house not only books and digital resources, but also serve as headquarters for the Foundation's Technical Assistance Program, where municipal officials from across the Northeast could receive training in procurement processes, project oversight, and community engagement strategies that prevented the kind of exploitation that had nearly stolen Millbrook's community development funds. Maya had learned that Frank's vision extended far beyond a single building or even a single community. He'd understood that sustainable change required institutional reform and cultural transformation that would protect future generations from the corruption that thrived in darkness and complexity. The letter that Maya pulled from her briefcase had arrived 3 days earlier from the mayor of a small town in Vermont, whose community center project had encountered familiar warning signs of cost overruns and contractor relationships that seemed designed to benefit private interests rather than public welfare. "We've heard about what you accomplished in Millbrook," the letter read, "and we're hoping you might consider helping us ask the right questions before our situation becomes as serious as yours was." Maya had received 47 similar requests during the past year, creating demand for foundation services that exceeded their current capacity but demonstrated the widespread nature of municipal corruption that Frank had recognized as a systemic problem requiring systematic solutions rather than individual interventions. Each invitation represented communities where ordinary families deserved honest governance and transparent use of resources they'd contributed through taxes and donations, believing that their trust would be honored by officials who'd sworn to serve public interests. As Maya prepared to leave Rosie's Diner and return to her office in the renovated Kowalski Industries building, now headquarters for a social enterprise that measured success through community benefit rather than profit maximization, she thought about Frank's final morning in this booth, when he'd left his ring and his newspaper as signals that someone else would need to continue the work he'd begun. The view from her window now included children playing in the community center's playground, seniors walking the accessible paths that connected the facility to downtown businesses, and young adults entering evening classes that would prepare them for careers that could support families while serving communities that had supported their development. Maya twisted Frank's ring around her finger one final time before standing to leave, understanding that his gift had been more than money or opportunity. It had been the chance to prove that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose courage over comfort and justice over personal advantage. The story of Maya Chen and Frank Kowalski would be remembered in Millbrook not as fairy tale about unexpected inheritance, but as proof that corruption could be defeated when good people refused to accept that systematic injustice was simply the way things worked in a world where power protected itself through complexity and professional intimidation. Sometimes, kindness opens doors that power never could. But more importantly, sometimes kindness provides the foundation for building systems that ensure doors remain open for everyone who deserves the opportunity to walk through them, with dignity and hope for a future where trust in democratic institutions can be earned through transparency, accountability, and unwavering commitment to serving the common good rather than private greed.